that whenever you grant perspective, you grant power. We've buried our heads so deeply, we're all playing our own little mini games. We like to organize the world into these simplified little systems of elements and simple rules, and we sort of organize these mini games of life, and then, we try to win them.
Hi, I'm Cannistraro. This is Raised Catholic Philosophy. Welcome. My guest is Rob Stroud. Today, Rob and I will be speaking about my favorite video podcast, which is Theories of Everything, Theories of Everything with Curt Jaimungal. And the reason I love this podcast is Curt and I share a passion for answering some of the big questions in life. And like Curt, I have a scientific disposition. I like to answer these questions scientifically, if at all possible. But I was raised Catholic, and my wider framework is what was imprinted upon me in a Catholic education growing up. So I think of all of this in the context of a wider world that I was taught to believe in, a transcendent reality, which I actually, as many people, I kind of moved on beyond, in a sense, growing up. But I'll be 74 years old in a couple of days. I want to figure some of this stuff out before I die, and maybe figure out what to expect or not when I die. So I like to answer these questions, if possible, in the broader context. And I have come to replace the theologically based ideas of the big world, the big wide universe, with philosophical ones, which I find more satisfying, and I think it's an even broader context than theology. So I like Curt. He asks the big questions, and he's open to philosophical perspectives. So I'd like to show you the opening of the episode of Toe that we're going to be talking about.
That whenever you grant perspective, you grant power. We've buried our heads so deeply, we're all playing our own little mini games. We like to organize the world into these simplified little systems of elements and simple rules, and we sort of organize these mini games of life, and then, we try to win them.
Today's episode is about free will. Is there even a theory of everything? And the physics of idealism, that is, the notion that consciousness is fundamental and only. We also touch on interpretations of quantum mechanics, where the observer has a privileged role in creating the universe. Matt O'Dowd is a science communicator and an astrophysicist, a professor at the City University of New York, involved in gravitationally lensed quasars, which touch on the crisis in cosmology, which is something that we'll speak about in this episode and for sure in the next one at length. Matt is also the host of PBS Space Time, which has over 2 million subscribers. I think it's 2.8, and they're the largest physics and space show on YouTube. And in case you're wondering who I am, my name is Curt Jaimungal. I have a background in mathematical physics, and this channel is Theories of Everything, which is dedicated to the theoretical physics endeavor of understanding gravity and quantum field theory, but as well as we investigate consciousness and the fundamental role it may have. If you're watching this, you'll see that I'm in a...
So, Rob, I just mentioned your name briefly, and your shingle says you're the Transcendent Psychotherapist. Could you tell us more about that and about yourself generally?
Yeah, sure. So, I am a psychotherapist by training. So my background is in psychodynamic therapy, and also trained in CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. So I work in the NHS by day, and then I do just a very small amount of private practice, one evening a week. And I guess transcendence like this, transcendence being, kind of that sort of field of knowledge of, what transcends, what leaps over categories of of reality. So transcendence is really kind of what's beyond, what's kind of underneath, what's kind of gets into the bigger stuff, I guess. And I suppose for me, I saw an increasing link between the psyche and the questions of transcendence and what kind of how we might answer the big questions. Because I was going to kind of talk about this a bit later, but I could just mention it briefly. That it's interesting to me that we look outwards into the cosmos to try and find the answers, and I'm wondering if it's the right direction.
Uh-huh.
In a sense, when we look at cosmology, science, and so on, there's the old adage, research is me search. That there is something that when we're looking out, we're kind of looking in. We're kind of looking at, these questions are coming from within us. And I just wondered, kind of like, if we consider the ground of being, the ultimate kind of what if we're after the kind of the undisputable knowledge of reality, the only indisputable knowledge there is, the only thing that can't be questioned is kind of like I am, that Descartes thing, cogito ergo sum. So the first kind of starting point, a solid starting point for me, I suppose, in understanding reality is I am, which could get you
by that, do you mean like your own subjective experience?
Yeah, so starting
it's not the question I am, but it's the fact that you have the subjective experience. That's all. That's all we've got.
Yeah, and that as your starting point, and maybe even something of the end point. But that's a whole set of questions to get into. I've gone off a bit of a rabbit hole there, but that's
Well, that's the thing about this field of endeavor, philosophy, and you get into metaphysics. They're all rabbit holes. There are rabbit holes all over the place, and it's very hard to stay on track. But is there any religious element? I mean, a lot of what you're talking about is within the domain of, at least in the West, of religion. So, is there any overlap there for you? I mean, I mentioned my Catholic upbringing, and that's the context for me. Is there a religious one for you? If it's not too impertinent to ask?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of my background, I was raised in a kind of Baptist church, but it's a fundamentalist Baptist church. I was sent to Sunday school since the age of about 3, 4. My parents didn't go. I think it was their morning off. So my dad used to take me swimming, and then I'd drop me off at Sunday school, and that happened for years and years on end. And we talked about this a bit last time, didn't we? In a way, does that childhood upbringing kind of open up for people, whether you hold to all of it or not as you grow up? Does it sort of open up a window that might not have opened up in terms of your broader thinking? I think it probably has for you as well,
Right. Well, I mean, that's why I say I recognize that factor by calling the broadcast Raised Catholic, because that really colors everything for me. I mean, I've moved beyond being a practicing Catholic and in most respects being a believing Catholic, but I can't shake that upbringing. It's my view of the world. I could never be somebody who would call himself an atheist, for example, or even though others would probably call me an atheist based on what my beliefs are versus what's taught. But I could never be self-identified as an atheist, and I could never willingly walk away from the idea of there being transcendence to begin with, So that's a psychological hardwiring that I have, that I suspect maybe you have. Other people who are open to the transcendent share that. So let's return to the podcast. So Matt, the reason for the podcast, why it was this episode, was that Matt O'Dowd, coincidentally, here we go. So in this clip, Matt O'Dowd, who is making this documentary about reality, what can we know about the truth of reality from a scientific perspective, he talks about the questions that he's trying to answer. and the perspective that he's taking.
One, but
Sure.
But they're deep.
Do you find that you're having a terrible amount of fun when you're delving into the more metaphysical side of physics and interpretations, so this film in particular, than you are with your own research?
It's funny, yeah. So I pursued astrophysics because it honestly it just seemed like the most fun, asking big questions about really big things. But over time, I've become more and more interested in the fundamental, and making space-time has been a big part of that also. And so I have no regrets. The universe is awesome, and it's really fun to solve big problems about the universe, and also the skills I picked up doing that sort of work, I'm able to bring to bear on some of these other questions. That said, I'm not a quantum theorist. I'm not even what most people would call a theoretical physicist, which means there are some skills that I'm going to have to work harder on. And so this movie is about, in a way, it's a personal journey, in that I really want to take stock of the field, and the fields, and to sort of get a sense of where humanity stands in this question and what the paths forward could be. And yeah, so that there's that personal level, but I also feel like it's a contribution, I think, at some level. We're by no means the only people talking about this stuff, but I think there's a rising collective interest in this big picture, asking questions like, what are we doing anyway? What is the goal of being human, and asking questions about the world? And I think anything we can do to sort of bring that collective curiosity together is useful, especially these days.
Help me understand how one goes from physics or even science, which is, to me, a description again. How does one go from that description to an ought?
Well, I think, the easy answer is just that whenever you grant perspective, you grant power. It's the same reason we do science communication on YouTube, I feel like it's no secret that we are a deeply factionalized species right now.
Fractionalized, meaning?
Yeah, factionalized. Like
factionalized,
sorry. Yeah. We've buried our heads so deeply. We're sort of we're all playing our own little mini games. We're overwhelmed, by the buzz of all media, by just the stuff going on in the world right now. And so we like to organize the world into these simplified little systems of elements and simple rules, and we sort of organize these mini games of life, and then we try to win them, like whether we're winning games of political dynamics at work, or trying to just stay solvent and collect enough retirement, or the game of empowering your chosen in-group. So we diminish the world so that we can handle it. And I guess the thing that science can do is that it can show us bigger landscapes, right? We are only able, so if you can imagine the infinite landscape of possible ways to live your life, possible things you can do, ways to be, we tend to blinker up and define these manageable sub landscapes, and we navigate those little spaces. But of course, we inevitably come to believe that our chosen little sliver is the world as it really is. Okay, we mistake the sub game for the game, and our compactification of reality in our minds becomes reality. And I am as guilty as most in that. But really, I'd say any type of education broadens perspective and shows us grander games, and that there are enormous landscapes of possibility, outside whatever rut we happen to be in. And so exposing people to new information is usually always good. Okay, there are exceptions, but science I find particularly important and powerful because in a way it's general. So science isn't about the subject matter, it's about.
Okay. So, Rob, we showed a pretty big chunk of the interview. We have their context for what they're talking about there, and what Matt O'Dowd is trying to accomplish in this movie. Any reactions?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. He's like kind of wanting to try and sounds like he's trying to sort of encourage people to sort of pan back a bit and take a broader perspective, and kind of using science as a tool to help people, just there's almost a slightly transcendent aspect to that, isn't there? It's kind of like that wow factor, the awe factor of science, perspective changing that can shift you out of your normal gear, routine, and kind of look at the world afresh. That was the sense I got from him, and maybe a sense also of like, perhaps there's a kind of unifying factor here, with the sort of the politics and everything. Everyone's kind of playing their own little game, but maybe kind of by looking up, if you like, or looking out at the universe, kind of asking the big questions in science, then that might be a kind of shared journey, we might join up some of our perspectives a bit more with that common ground. That's the sense I got of what he was saying. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this. Suppose Matt O'Dowd were to call you up and say, Mr. Transcendent Psychotherapist, I want to have a wide appeal. I want you to want to watch my movie. Do you think I have a good approach? I'm speaking, for Matt O'Dowd. Do you think I have a good approach? What would you suggest I change, if anything?
Yeah, I don't know enough of him to be too hasty in my generalizations, but the metaphor that came to mind was I imagine like all these goldfish swimming in a goldfish bowl. They're all swimming around and they're kind of going, what's this? What's this kind of weed stuff? And really understanding all the different mechanics of the bowl. I don't know whether that would allow you, and I don't want to actually, I'm not asking this as a rhetorical question trying to make a definite point as a yes or no, but does that in itself allow us to transcend the bowl, if you like, to kind of say, like if we drill down to the very bottom of nature, would we certainly I think it would expand our horizon from our corner of the bowl, if you like, but does it allow us to actually get out of the bowl and beyond the bowl? Does it allow us to, like even if like so I can't remember the guy's name now, someone that Bernardo Kastrup did an interview with, I want to say James somebody, he's a physicist, but he looks at like the idea of the universe as a simulation, for example. Like, let's suppose we discover it's a kind of simulation, but we can't get out of the program. We've kind of got into all the different algorithms. We've got as far as we can in kind of understanding, but we're part of it. How to what extent can exploring the formatting of the program, nature, can we get to? It takes us to more and more interesting questions around the program, but do we ever get out of the program?
Right. So you're talking about transcendence in a very secular. I'll call it a secular way, as opposed to a religious way. I mean, talking about holographic projections has a scientific bent to it. Well, I'm only pointing it out because I've recently gotten over my allergy to talking about things religious. I noticed I was always defending myself, always saying, don't mistake me for a fundamentalist or even a religious believer of any kind. I'm just talking about philosophy, metaphysics, and I realize that to many of my colleagues, many people who I deal with in my book group and other endeavors, that they have an allergy to talking about religion or even hinting that they're sympathetic to it. And so, like Matt O'Dowd, do you think he would be open to looking at traditional religious concepts of transcendence? And do you think that he should be open to that? And if he wants to truly answer the big questions, can he answer the big questions constrained by the reach of scientific instruments?
Yeah, I mean, at one point in the interview, not in the clip that you showed there, but Curt asks him about Tim Maudlin, I think his name is,
Yes.
quantum, and he kind of said there how, one of the first things he does in his classes on quantum physics is a bit of an introduction to metaphysics, and saying, you can't do science without metaphysics. I mean, science itself is predicated on all sorts of metaphysical assumptions. You can't do science without philosophy. I mean, we make all sorts of assumptions about whether the external world is real, whether I'm a solipsist entity in a machine being fed information like a brain in a vat. There's no getting around the kind of philosophical questions. But I suppose of the religious angle, I mean, I certainly think depends what we mean by religious, doesn't it, as well? It's like,
yes,
we mean a dogmatic religion, like every single jot and tittle of Catholic doctrine needs to be is useful or helpful for understanding the world, or do we mean kind of a kind of religious instinct in human beings that is asking the bigger why questions, what's our purpose, and so on? I think in that broader sense, that is just something that's always been with humanity. We look back on the sort of anthropology, look around, it seems to be there's an evolving capacity with language to also think and look up at the night sky and look at the stars. And with that, it's sort of that science in that very rudimentary early sense and the development of religion come hand in hand. Other animals, as far as we can see, don't do that. That religion is not a retrograde step in the sense it's part of the wandering human mind, and it's not something we're ever going to get rid of, nor do I think we should. But it's just what kind of religion do we have might be more the Well,
I think it might be the terms that we use when we describe religion and what buttons they push, what associations we make with people who are anti-science, for example. I mean, my upbringing as a Catholic, I went to a relatively liberal, I suppose, Catholic high school, and we were taught that the natural world is what it is, and religion has to adapt itself to scientific realities and reframe its scientific its dogma to be harmonious with what we know to be fact, rather than deny the fact. So I thought, well, that always made sense to me. But today, at least in the United States where I live, it's if you talk about Christianity, the image that's in the media is fundamentalism. It's not very sophisticated at all, and they look at scripture as history, as a history book, as a science book, as an answer to all these questions that are really the domain of science or history and things that are secular. So anyway, I talking about my allergy, I realize that when I use a term, I use a word that reminds people of traditional religious concepts, they question, is he some kind of a wacko religious believer? Which of course I don't think I'm wacko, and I've moved on from religious beliefs, but I certainly do see potential value of understanding the world in the context of some of the wisdom that's been accumulated and passed along in theology, which is influenced by philosophy. So that's where the again where the raised Catholic connection is. So shall I continue with the clips, and maybe the next brief clip will be of interest. Right.
Okay, the methodologies, if you like, of truth finding, and those methods can be applied, at least at some level, to any question or any field in ways that improve our ability to explore the landscapes of, that aspect of reality. And so, I mean, granting people the access to some of the things we've learned in science that are incredibly powerful, the methodologies, the ways of thinking, even just the habits of thought, are just super powerful tools for improving how people even live their lives, because these ideas become embedded, become subliminal, and I guess maybe the way I think about science is that it's like a formalization of how our brains work naturally. If you think of our minds as tools for navigating the world, and that's the physical world, the social world, and worlds of arbitrary abstraction, and so cognition, which is the process of asking questions, seeking evidence, formulating models and hypotheses, and making choices, which sounds an awful lot like science. And in our brains, that's all happening constantly and mostly subconsciously. And also, I guess an important thing is that we don't just do this individually. So we engage in this sort of collective cognition, through discussion with each other in an explicit way, but also you could argue that we are cogitating as a society through art and religion and politics, and so we can think about culture, I guess, as this collective cognition, and even I like to think of culture as a search algorithm for truth. Okay, so if part of culture is a world model, okay, and every culture has its consensus reality, then that little kind of local minimum in the possibility space of what the world is and how to live it is something that culture found. And so, cultural evolution, I guess, sort of navigates the landscape of possible ways to think about and can make us better at it individually or collectively. Then we get better at mapping the landscape.
Here's the thought that occurs to me. If science is the epitome.
All right, the recording, I think, is still going on. Okay. So any reactions to that?
No, it actually reminded me, I hadn't thought of it until you just showed it there, of something a guy called Mark Vernon writes about. He's just released a book called Spiritual Intelligence in 7 Steps. He's a psychotherapist as well, actually, but that sometimes writes for The Guardian in the UK. And in there, he talks about kind of anthropologists and kind of countering some of the ideas of, can't get his name right now, Noel Harari, Joshua.
Oh yeah, Harari. Yeah,
Harari. Yeah,
he writes big history books.
Yeah, and just sort of challenging some of the ideas there. And Mark Vernon's worked with Robin Dunbar from Cambridge University. I know it's Oxford University. I know. Just looking at this idea of niches, so that creatures are kind of shaped by their environment, so they evolve to specialize into different areas, at different niche areas, and like water is the niche for fish, etc., etc. And he was talking about how humans, it links back to what we were saying earlier, how humans have in their history kind of evolved different orders of cognition. So you can end up with, I can think, I know what I'm thinking, I can think about what you're thinking, so I've got like a theory of mind, that's like second or third order, I can't remember the right one. And now you can think about that, I'm thinking about what you're thinking about, and so on. And then I can know that you know that we as a tribe are knowing that, and you've got these orders of cognition going up, and how humans kind of moved into this kind of imaginal space, and we're able to kind of start to think and imagine worlds and the possibility space kind of opening up. And he kind of just wonders aloud, really. He calls it Homo spiritualis, that man is not just Homo sapiens, but Homo spiritualis, that we've evolved into this kind of, just as the fish inhabits water as a niche, humans also inhabit spiritual spaces, and kind of sees that as like, well, that's...
Yeah, well, that's people are going to get it. Some people are allergic to that word, spiritual.
Yeah. Well, and it's a very vague term. He kind of talks about that in the book. I just, been listening to it on Audible. But he talks about it in that transcendent sense of things to do with the sense of beingness and awareness. And I suppose there's elements of kind of metacognition that would come into it as well, and kind of imagined spaces. But that we can, it kind of suggests, I suppose, that not necessarily that everything that we imagine is therefore true and exists, but that we are tapping into an environment. It's not necessarily a physical environment, but evolution is progressing in that direction partly. I think, is it Pierre Chardin, Teilhard de Chardin, Chardin Teilhard?
Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, something like that.
Yeah, those ideas of evolution also pushing in
the noosphere.
Yeah, unfolding, into something bigger. Yeah. Anyway, just thought I'd chuck that off.
It's funny you mentioned Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. I was exposed to him in high school and in college, and it wasn't until recently that I learned that he had been silenced by the Jesuit order and therefore by the church. He was so on the cutting edge because he was a scientist, and evolution was something that he accepted as as close as you can get to a scientific fact. It's a theory that works, and he was a paleontologist, I think. I mean, I think he was involved in discovering fossils of Peking man, or one of these critical links. So he was. So he tried to harmonize Christianity with his science, and it turned out that what he published, he actually published in the form of, he didn't publish, he just sent letters to people, and the letters were kept until he died, and then they were published. So, but he is probably the one person responsible for my not moving on from Catholicism, because I realized that Catholicism contained, and I thought more openly contained, the likes of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. So I held on to that, and I said, there's wisdom in this tradition, and there's probably a lot of wisdom in there that is not appreciated by secularly oriented individuals, and that's why I hung on. That's why I anymore. But that's how it goes, and that's how these things get perpetuated. I think by imprinting or trying to imprint these ideas into children. But yeah, that's a digression. But it's a significant. He's a significant figure for me. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
An interesting kind of talk there about the kind of link between science and religion again, and there's been a almost deliberate perpetuation, sort of what I might call Enlightenment propaganda, of this unavoidable war between science and religion. I think there has been to some extent, but it gets exaggerated. I mean, just the number of scientists in science's history that, especially some of the early pioneers that had a religious background, is quite staggering, and yeah, I think Bernardo talks about it a bit, doesn't he, in some of his videos about how
we should mention who you're talking about. Bernardo,
oh, sorry, yeah, we should. Yeah. Bernardo Kastrup, the philosopher of mind, is writing. He's an idealist, isn't he? Talking about kind of how some, to some extent, the church sectioned off scientific. And a lot of these early scientists were Christians or Catholics or religious and monks often, but how it kind of sectioned off. You can explore the world of nature, but kind of leave the mind and the soul and the bigger questions to us, because that's our domain. And that's kind of actually caused the kind of rift that we see. You can't just blame science or skeptics or the irrationalist types. It's a split that has origins, he argues, kind of in the church, and it's saying, well, this is our magisterium, these are the kind of things that we want to kind of hold on to and speak about authoritatively. You can go and play with nature.
I have a different understanding of what he said. I'm not saying that what you're saying is wrong, because I'm just saying that I internalize that a little bit differently. What we're seeing is a persistent overreaction to the heavy-handedness of specifically the Catholic Church through the centuries, up into the Renaissance, when people started to rebel against that. But they dominated everything in the West as far as human knowledge goes, and basically there's only one legitimate, proper worldview. That was the Catholic worldview, and it included what would eventually become science. And as people wanted to practice science, and they were butting heads against the church, there was this terrible conflict, and eventually, at around the time of Descartes, Galileo, and so on, they hammered out this division between science, what natural philosophy, they started calling it science, and they separated that from areas of religion, which still included the mind, still included what you would call the spiritual side of things. So I think that you have this division, and it's unfortunate, because just as you have no problem talking about transcendence, and I have no problem talking about transcendence from a purely secular, non-dogmatic point of view, everybody should be open to that perspective. It shouldn't be something that is closed off, because anything associated with the other side of the wall, people have become allergic. I say, secular people have become allergic to, and they reject anything. Even the idea of metaphysics is rejected by many scientists, who think that the only thing that is demonstrably true is what's scientific, and if it's not scientific, you can't say it's true.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of generational shift as well, in that I think there's a large category of what are called nons, aren't they, if I don't pronounce that correctly, of sort of spiritual but not religious. I think that's what I was kind of, it comes back to what I was saying earlier about, actually we all have this kind of instinct, this spiritual instinct to us. And I think there is a certain generation of scientists whose kind of view is very much shaped by what you talked about a minute ago, and that kind of aftermath of those kind of wars, or the turf wars, I guess, between the Enlightenment and Catholic Church, and that you ended up with a very sort of dogmatic and modernist view of the world, a very sterile and reductionist view of the world. And I think that's changing. We're seeing that shift in people like Bernardo Kastrup and Don Hoffman, and there's this massive openness now, and I think there's a huge convergence in interest in spirituality. And we just look at like the Dalai Lama and research in neuroscience and meditation, and we are entering a very different phase now. And was someone joked once, wasn't it? Science progresses one funeral at a time.
Yeah. Do you think that there's room for more scientific influence in religion?
Yeah.
Or do you think that? I'm not a theologian. You're not a theologian, but we've probably both been exposed to theology in our studies in the past. But do you think that like people like Bernardo Kastrup, who's a philosopher, do you think he should be a source of information and ideas for the old theologians, or do you think he should stick to the science and philosophy side?
I don't know. Well, I'm not a theologian as such. I do have a theology degree, so I did do that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Well, I
yeah.
suspected. I suspected.
Did you? Okay, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's funny, isn't it? Like, knowledge is so niche with specializations within specialization and special. It's good if people overlap really, and kind of integrate their field of knowledge. So I think it's always welcome to have the mutual influence. I even heard of a field calls it neurotheology.
Neurotheology.
Neurotheology, yeah.
What is that?
I think it's I don't know entirely, but I think it's looking at kind of neuroscience and the overlap and the implications of neuroscience on theology, maybe to some extent vice versa, but yeah. It gets into the idea, I think Dawkins talked about this, didn't he, about the NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. Science has got its domain, and theology.
Well, that's one way to do it. I mean, I suppose if you're a practicing believer of any kind, and you work in science, you have to keep things separate in your mind. If you think that the Bible is a source of science information, you can't use that in your work. No. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there must be many religious believers who work in scientific fields and have a way of compartmentalizing that.
Yeah, and I think the danger is, so you don't want any kind of particular dogma dominating a scientific inquiry, right? So, but we also got to bear in mind that you can have naturalism in the sense of nature is all there is, and you can have kind of what's the word, or atheism infiltrating into the way that we do science. So we've got to keep the God question out to some degree. It's like, how do you do it? If scientia, science, means just knowledge, scientia, if it's the quest to have a theory of everything or to know more, you can't in advance kind of say, well, the natural sciences can tell us everything about everything. It's where can science overreach, and what do we mean by science? Are we just talking about natural sciences? And again, I think it kind of, there's just that blurring that goes on. I don't think you can have a strictly non-overlapping magisteria, because your theoretical background worldview will always shape how you interpret the data. There's no such thing as science there's no such thing as a neutral worldview. Every time we observe phenomena, and we're trying to interpret and make sense of things. I'm not suggesting that automatically, therefore, we just want to get into the realm of speculation and bring that into our way of interpreting science, but also we don't want to overstep the mark the other way and kind of then just say, well, just all we know within the goldfish bowl, but to use my earlier metaphor, is all there is.
You're in the UK and I'm in the US. I'm in New York, and this is not about the whole podcast, but it's about the shifting attitudes toward religion. In the United States, it seems that the only people who are religious and who are vocal are conservative, fundamentalist, not open to looking outside of religion for answers to important questions, and instead look to the Bible and the increasingly political advice given by their pastors and so on. Is it like that in the UK as well?
No. Well, of course, they have when they say the Bible, it's their particular interpretation of, say, the King James Bible or whatever it is. They're very narrow, and they're not even open generally theologically within, say, looking at, say, Scripture. They're kind of, they've got their set of doctrines that they read the Bible through. Even Protestants, Reformed people that argue that the Bible is the ultimate authority, not the Pope, etc. They have their kind of cherry-picked doctrines that are ones interpret the Bible through those lenses, etc., etc. But in the UK, we're much more secular. I mean, officially, the king, as it now is, King Charles is the head of the Church of England. So officially, it's a religious state. We have bishops in the House of Lords, which is our upper chamber. So compared to the US, it's a religious state, whereas you've got a secular state officially. But ironically, it's worked out the other way around. Ironically, we've got a very kind of open, liberal kind of. The Church of England is as liberal as you like. You could be the odd atheist vicar, I think. But I mean, there are fundamentalists in the UK. They don't have the same clout, and they're not as fundamentalist as you guys get in the States. Yeah.
You think that there are advantages to being the way the UK is, where you do have a nominal presence of religion versus not having any presence at all?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether it's a product of that being established in that way, or whether it's just a outcome of history. Because we had our wars of religion back in the 15th, 16th century,
right?
And there was a sort of, I think it's called the Elizabethan settlement. There's a sort of gradual kind of growing up, I suppose, of tolerance of. Back in the 18th century, 19th century tolerance of Catholics, because it was obviously Henry VIII broke with Rome, and you had this kind of the Church of England was a Protestant state, or Henry being in charge basically, so he could get his divorces. But there was a sort of a tolerance of wider non-conformist religious groups as well, like the Baptists and Quakers and so on. I suppose it's just a sort of zeitgeist thing. Britain has a less revolutionary approach to politics and everything. It's so we had a civil war, killed the king, executed the king, brought the king back, and now we've sort of fudged it together into sort of parliamentary constitutional monarchy. It's a very sort of slow evolution. It seems to work sort of roughly.
Right.
I don't think it does. Probably doesn't. Yeah.
But I guess my question is, to the extent that you do have religion in public life, do you think that's a net good or not?
Oh, I don't know how I'd even work that out. I think
it's not a fair question to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly see the nefarious aspects of it in the States.
It certainly is not working well. To the way religion is so insinuated into politics right now. Yeah. It is terrible.
There's worrying trends as well, and even within Catholicism, and it's called integralism. Seeking to try to get more kind of secular power again. There's that kind of move, and it's a fusion between, like you say, politics and religion, which I think is generally a bad idea. I mean, one of the good things I like in the Old Testament is that there was generally a principle, as it matured, at least the Old Testament, of that your prophets should be able to speak to power. You separate the prophets from the kings. That's a good tradition, really, in a way. We should be able to speak truth to power.
It seems that people like myself, I still am comfortable with my religious background, but people like myself don't practice religion anymore. The sane people, I'll call myself one of the sane people, have moved on, and left religion to fundamentalists, which is not a good thing. Politically, I mean, I happen to think the more variety, the better in any endeavor, in any institution. I think our best ideas come from working out conflicts and trying to accommodate everybody to the extent you can. And where everybody thinks the same, nobody's thinking very much, and you go off in one direction, philosophically, ideologically, whatever, and usually that's not good for the larger society. At least that's my impression. But now we've strayed real far from toe. Well, listen, Well, I only really prepared to discuss the first half of that 2-hour interview. The second half gets a little bit more interesting. I stopped right before they got into free will. Free will is a pretty interesting topic. Are you up on free will? You have ideas on free will?
Yes, I did dive into that. That's where I thought it got particularly interesting, the discussion a bit. I can't remember all of Matt's ideas now, but he seemed to be sort of.
Well, I was going to say we could. I'm just suggesting that we do this again and
Okay.
begin. We can begin and maybe devote the whole conversation, if that is what makes sense, to free will. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll say goodbye for now then. All right, and we'll do a part 2 in short order, and
Yeah.
we'll put them out. Okay.
Okay, sounds
All
good.
right. So thank you very much.
Well, pleasure, Al.
Yeah, I will. I'm going to. Well, that's our first episode of Raised Catholic Philosophy. Thanks so much for sticking it out. It's got to get better next time, right? Next time, I'll be speaking again with Rob Stroud, and also a friend of mine from upstate New York, a philosopher and economist, Mark Lawton. And we'll be discussing primarily free will, which is what takes up the second half of the TOE podcast that we spoke about this time. Now, here's a hint about what Matt O'Dowd has to say about free will. He says you have a choice. If you want to believe in free will, it's your choice. And he thinks it's a good idea to believe in free will. He makes a case. Now, besides talking about the TOE podcast on Raised Catholic Philosophy, I'm going to get into things that are of interest to me, having been raised Catholic in a very devotional Italian-American household in the 1950s and 60s. And also went on to become a very curious Catholic about Catholic history, about Catholic dogma, Catholic concepts, the good, the bad, the ugly. So I'll be talking about that, learning about that, and maybe you'll find that of interest yourself. So as they say, like, subscribe, come back, talk about it. We'll see you next time.